Tonight, we have a very special presentation in its content and form. The transdisciplinary artist Robert Buck, formerly known as Robert Beck, is here to share the ideas that direct what he refers to as his operation, as opposed to a practice. I met Robert through my friend and the founder-director of Ulterior Gallery in New York, Takako Tanabe, who has championed Robert Buck with two consecutive exhibitions of his work. Robert Buck graduated with a BFA from NYU Tisch School of Arts, Film and TV Department in 1983, and a decade later, he was part of the renowned Whitney Independent Study Program. He has exhibited nationally and internationally since the 1990s. In 2008, motivated by developments in his art making, Beck changed his last name by a single vowel from E to U. He is an ambitious and rigorous artist whose work is included in impressive collections such as the Museum of Modern Art in New York, Whitney Museum of American Art, SF MoMA, Dallas Museum of Art, the Getty in LA, Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus, Ohio, and the Centre Pompidou in Paris. He is a contributing writer to the forthcoming On Andy Warhol, part of Dia Art Foundation's Artist on Artist publication series, and the exhibition catalog Cheryl Donegan Girls Plus Veils at the Aspen Museum of Art. I should also note he currently has some interesting work in the project room of the Aaron Cluley Gallery in Dallas. Accompanying Robert's presentation this evening, we are honored to have Shelley Hardell and Bob Barker here to provide sign language interpretation. I am personally intrigued by this addition in relation to Robert's work, in particular, his interest in language. Of course, there is the fact that this addition expands and extends communication. As I understand it, Shelley is certified in American Sign Language, which she is signing to Bob, who is a certified deaf interpreter, who will then sign a more nuanced interpretation to the audience. This seems expansive, generous, and of course correct. I saw this development as both practical and performative, but in Robert's notes, he has made it clear that he will not use the word performance in relation to this service, beautifully elaborating on his reasons, which I will leave to him to share. So at this time, please join me in welcoming Robert Buck, Shelley Hardell, and Bob Barker.
Thank you, Terry, for that flattering and lovely introduction. And thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you all for coming tonight, bringing your bodies with you. The timing of this lecture was fortuitous. I didn't know that, of course, when I said yes. But it kind of dovetails with a new body of work, which I will be showing you towards the end. So I'm extracted one aspect of my large and multi-transdisciplinary works to show you tonight, specific to the new work. I'm also bringing you the gift of not being totally prepared. Because I thought this was in the spirit, too, of the new work, which is happening spontaneously, out of the corner of my eye. Aha, presto, there we go, that's a work. I have never proceeded in that way. So when you see the new work, go easy on me, because you're the first guys to see it. Any great artist, I think, if you were to really reduce it, as in life, there are two chords, eros and thanatos. sex, and death. Those two chords are chords I continue to play in my work, just because of my past, etc. But the beautiful timing of Terry's invitation is it's allowed me to extract the more sexy side of my work: sexuality, sexuation, life, pleasure, desire. So I thought this was an appropriate image to begin with. I am also interested in language, the body, and psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis is nothing more but everything about, nothing more but nothing less, I guess is what I want to say, than the effects of language on the body. So this is the moment that I would like to thank Bob and Shelley for their presence here tonight, for widening the scope of the audience, and for really embodying, if you will, a principle of mine. All are welcome. This series of Polaroids, or Kodaks, I began in 1978 as a young person in New York City. I moved there for college and had this camera because of my day job at the Gap, doing windows. But at this time in one's life, my life, there really was no separation between art and life. But then you kind of go to school and the university, and there's this ossifying, separating process where art is this, and it's on this stream of history and academia, and life is over here, the Mud Club, Tier 3, CBGBs, etc. But for me, those two things were one and the same. And New York City in the end of the 1970s was bankrupt. But I'm also showing you these, which meant that there was a tremendous freedom in the city. I'm also showing these because they are really the roots, the bedrock, the fundaments of what follows. And when you look at this work, if the images themselves don't say sexuation and desire and identity, because that's also what I'm talking about when I talk about these things, my work has always been about the self, identity, or subjectivity. And if you know the Kodak, it's a quite small format. The scale of these works will vary tremendously. I'll try and keep in mind what those shifts are. In 1993, I did go through the independent study program of the Whitney Museum. And for my thesis project, I did a series of true crime pages, those pages you find in the middle of a true crime novel, using my own life as a subject matter. I had been going to school at NYU for film. And what I was surprised by, in that beautiful way that art is able to do, is these prints are a kind of montage. And these are the size that you would find, in the book themselves. So you have 3 images, a background, and even without the caption, you might imagine what that narrative is. But what also these works do is they implicate the viewer. What are your experiences? What do you imagine this narrative to be? How do you fill in the blanks? This is another strain of my work, that it very much calls on the viewer to be a part of the interpretive process. Marcel Duchamp said that it's a kind of meeting in the middle, that the viewer completes the work of art. So that's very much in evidence, no pun, in my work. This is my brother and sister and I, Christmas 1968. The frame was the artwork. I reframed it. I point this out because of the autobiographical nature of the work. This was a series of drawings I did by shooting a shotgun into a sketch pad. I grew up shooting game and objects, target practice with my father, and I thought, well, why not a sketch pad? Because a sketch pad in some way has a relationship, a more immediate relationship to the body and to the artist, him or herself. And I like this work because at first you might apperceive it as a petunia, a flower, something floral, and then upon closer inspection you realize this is an extremely violent act. And that clash, that kind of riptide, is very important because it's kind of like where I'm trying to put you. To negotiate these two different gestures. And to take something that's violent and transform it into something that's beautiful. Also, at the same time, I began a series of drawings called Diagnostic Drawings, where I would, in my own hand, redraw something that was in a psychological personality, like a psychological test book or personality case study, wherein an individual, usually a young person, makes a drawing and a doctor prescribes what that personality is, which can be kind of like a scarlet letter that this individual has to carry on through the rest of their life. They're marked by it in some way. So what I did was to include in every drawing the diagnosis, so that the viewer, again, placing themselves between these two aspects, has to see what in the diagnosis is there in the drawing. At the same time, some drawings were coming back to me. And what I would do is just draw one drawing over another one. So this one, this horse, with what is called, from the famous study by Freud, Little Hans, the horse is Whittler. You have this other drawing about, I think it's a father and son. So one drawing comments on the other drawing, the more time, hopefully, that you spend with the work. The father is a very important aspect to my work, my body of work as Robert Beck. Because when Terry tells you that I changed my name in 2008, what I did was change my father's name. That's always like, your father's name? But that's your name. So this is why I now have an identification with the trans community, because something wasn't working, you change it. And thank goodness we live now in a time of identity spectrum, so that these changes can occur by the subject, him or herself. But also, Terry pointed out, the homophony from E to U. Oh, and as long as well, I'll get back to that. But this is another example of a diagnostic drawing. So from the sketch pads, I went to something called wound filler, or mortician's wax. These are buckets that you buy from, you can't make this stuff up, the Dodge Corporation. That was just a given. But what I would do with my father is we would take these 25-pound bulk wax forms out of the bucket and shoot probably a foot away, and that would leave the corona of wax. Of course, wax has a huge art historical lineage, and working with wax in this way was very appealing to me. And these function for me as like a kind of conceptual figure eight, because the very thing that would fill the hole bears the hole. So you kind of just go round and round. This was a series of drawings called Glove Skinning that appeared in a book that my parents gave me when I was much too old for such a thing, like As a Man, How to Survive in the Wilderness, or something like this. But this reminds me of Freud's A Child is Being Beaten, because the squirrel's bottom reminded me of a child's bottom, and what you're seeing, all the lashings, that's shoe polish on a belt. And if you look very closely, as of course I did when I was making this last image is the hood of a Ku Klux Klan member. So hopefully that's the kind of, some of my work I describe as like a bouillon cube. It expands in time, hopefully. That's my wish for them anyway. So I've just threaded these through because these were kind of like the soundtrack, as I like to refer to them, for my work as Robert Beck. This was a splash partition found in men's rooms that I had collected the graffiti and appended to the splash guards myself. I was very happy when people seeing these in an exhibition thought that they were ready-mades, like I found them. I was teaching at SVA at the time, and it seemed like there was this push-pull between the custodians and the students. The custodian would cover something up, the student would say, oh, a new canvas, and then, the cycle would continue. This is one of my favorites. In creating this drawing, Ken was dealing with such an exciting fantasy that he wet his pants. And then, by boy, aged 5 years, 7 months, phase 2. What's phase 2? Person begins to emerge. And so you kind of get lost in which is which. This is quite a large piece. It measures maybe 6 feet high by 4.5 wide. I think it speaks for itself. I was interested, again, in the body and gestures. It's a beautiful juxtaposition we have right now. And the way that certain discourses or institutions dictate what those gestures are. I had an art advisor in the studio not long after I did these, and he said one of the best things, he's like, it's so dirty. They're so violated. And I think, when we think of what's happening again with the Catholic Church, that's not far off. This is a series that I did around the same time called Screen Memory. This is really large. This is like 7 feet by maybe 5.5, in which I took dime store images that I grew up with, and I rephotographed them in the rooms where they hung in my childhood home. So there's no distinction. What you get the room reflected in the glass, but the distinction between inside and out is blurred. And what is more, when it's hanging in a collector's home or in a museum, the room of where it's hanging is also reflected. So you're in this kind of miasma of reflections and meanings and trying to pull one from the other. This was my sister's room. You can see a curtain there on the left, a 4-post bed. There's a bed post right there. And I liked the abstract moments as well as the more distinguishable ones. Also for me as an artist, what happens, my operation is that something occurs quite spontaneously, but then it develops over time and becomes more and more refined. So those early splash cards are now stainless steel partition dividers, but handled in a more painterly way, where the catalog of references isn't necessarily graffiti, but it has a relationship to painting. And while the splash cards were hung where you find them in the men's room, these were hung at 57 inches eye level. So it elevated the everyday artifact. But also in my work, if you haven't picked up on it, there's like the sacred and the profane. I'm a lapsed Catholic. But I'm not the first to say this, but Catholicism gives a child, an artist, anyone for that matter, I think a grip on formalism, ritual, myth. If you think of the work of Andy Warhol or Robert Mapplethorpe, you see that almost a fetishization of the ritualistic aspects of the discourse of religion. This is one of my favorites. Splash card, done with a CNC machine, honeycomb, and wood grain. So reductive. And that's what I aim for. I think when you just, if there are artists here or anyone who's making things in life, just you begin, and then it becomes more and more refined, and you see what you were maybe after to begin with anyway. This was one of 2 sculptural pieces called Constellation Bless You. I wanted to do more of these, but circumstance didn't allow, but it turned out okay, because this is kind of like a guide of some kind to Robert Beck, and there's one coming up that's kind of a guide or a graph of some sort for Robert Buck. And the Buck was there all along in my work. So I was quite surprised when I did change my father's name by a single vowel, by the response. But it's almost like a spirit animal of some sort. Like I felt like I had an appointment with this alteration, this metamorphosis. Now's a good time as any. Why I liked the name change artistically is because it was done just with one letter. And what did I get for that letter? I got 4 immediate associations. Money, buck, a son in tribal Native American Indian cultures, the stag, but most importantly, to dislodge, to throw something off your back. So someone said to me, you know, you might think this is your greatest work of art, but this was a dealer. I'm sorry, I'm talking out of class. The dealer said, but I can't sell it. Which meant that it hit something, that it shook her, which is really what I aim to do. In this way, I have an affinity with the filmmaker David Lynch, who really wants to cause anxiety or subjective division, rattle you. I always aim to do that. And the name change really, I think, exemplified my ability to do that, or my wish to do that. These canvases are quite large, again, maybe 5 feet by 4. They're taken from the very first word association study devised in 1917. Again, with one word, you would be graded on how, graded in quotes, according to the frequency of other associations. So if you said, oh, well, afraid means coward because of its opposite meaning, then you were, like, I guess, in the healthy part of the gradient. Blossom, afraid, chain of association. Someone once said to me, these operate quite effectively because we are imprisoned by what language allows us to say or not say. And there is something ultimately that falls outside of language. That's also what interests me about language. There are some things that are unspeakable. This one has sexual connotations. The word above it is ocean, ocean head. We'll get to that later. Also in this period, you begin to see something receding. There's something on the surface, and there's something in the beyond, in the distance, in the background. That one, the torso of the boy, is from Gray's Anatomy, the book, the famous anatomical textbook. Again, it was a drawing I did. It came back to me, and I thought, well, I'm just going to make things a little bit more complex, and I drew over it. What you see that may look like graphite is actually latent fingerprint powder used by crime scene investigators. So this idea of latency, dormancy, something embedded that you might overlook, also becomes very important to the work. The writer Dale Peck once said to me, "You're almost out of the gallery. You didn't see it all. Something calls you back." And I aim for that as well, at the risk of people overlooking part of what is there. This was the last piece that I did as Robert Beck, and it is called, on the heels of what I just said, Vane. Those other ones were chain of association, yes, and these are Vane of association, quote, animals that hide, imitate, and bluff, from a book by Lilo Hess. So, in the animal kingdom, there are two ways of escaping predation. This is fascinating for me. I don't know how many of you have a coffee, but the first is mimicry, right? So you're a butterfly, you open your wings, boom, boom, you have two eyes. They're allies. So a snake or something comes after you, boom, boom, you're an owl. That's metaphor. A butterfly that looks like an owl, or a moth, more specifically, that looks like an owl. That's metaphor. We'll get to this later if there's time. The other one is, say, a cuttlefish. The cuttlefish moves along the surface of the bottom of the ocean floor and changes color according to the background. Or a chameleon. That is metonymy. Metaphor is like this, metonymy like this. So this changing, this sliding from one thing to another, lo and behold, can be found in nature. I remember reading this in Walter Benjamin and was just like, we're really not so far away from the animal kingdom. What makes us different, of course, is language. And we're impregnated by language. We have no choice. It's a false choice to say that we refuse language. Oh, but here's the thing. Bird, in my own silly way. Bird on one side. Bee on the other. So this is a birdie playing dead, and this is a bee of some kind pretending to be an ant. I don't know. I forget what the caption says, but there are two forms of mimicry. Technically, this was done with a digital printer, the chains, and then this is silkscreen. So in 2008, I had my first exhibition as Robert Buck. It's a work of art, plain and simple, and one that does not have an object attached to it, but has a conceptual framework. And just allow me one moment of reference to psychoanalysis as defined by Jacques Lacan. There are three consistencies: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. So in the symbolic, when Andy Warhol changes his name to Andy Warhol, or Philip Goldstein changes his name to Philip Guston, that's in the symbolic register. Names, naming, language. When Marcel Duchamp dresses up in drag as Eros s'élève, that's in the imaginary. David Bowie as Ziggy Stardust, that's the imaginary. But the letter, it flies free in the real. Where's it going? How does that hit you? The E can be anything. It has no immediate consistency. There's no symbolic to hold it. There's no imaginary to hold it. So this is what excited me about the change, but also made it very difficult for people. But in that way, exemplified my desire to do something that would rattle. I also changed my name at the height of the market in 2007, because I felt like we could just keep doing this, but it wasn't commensurate with the art that I grew up with, which was Jackson Pollock and Carl Andre and Rothko and all of those artists that genuinely created new knowledge in the culture. It wasn't just coming from the academic discourse. It was art that, what was the thing? The shock of the new. The shock of the new. So how do we do that in a world that is moving at a greater velocity and overly capitalized? The market, the art market. This is the second constellation I was telling you about. That's a suitcase. That's a headstone that is yet to be inscribed. That's a magic eye picture, which, you know, if you stare in the right way, you get like a hidden picture. And that was a stealth bomber. What interested me in this period of my creative life was how objects and commodities could cross borders more readily and easily than people. Still that way, even more that way. Like, we have an epidemic of refugees on our hands. Anyway, you get my drift. These are quite large. These are called vane of association, like a weather vane. And they were meant to be taken apart and put back together in any formation that the collector might, or gallerist might want. So you have the universe, a woman, and a honeycomb. You can see the honeycomb rhizome pictured differently there, or contributed, arranged differently. Magic hat, mountain range, and balls of cotton. I think of these things as flashcards. What are your associations with these things? This was a series of camouflaged honeycomb hexagon shaped that were hydrographically printed. And it's a camouflage that is called mothwing. And all of the entire scene is created out of moth wings. So if you look at the branches, everything is this trompe l'oeil pattern, again, about mimicry. And the story goes that there was a hunter who was hunting, and he was been at this tree all morning, and he realized that right in front of his face was a moth, camouflaged in the bark. So he thought, well, let's forget our father's camouflage and come up with something that was even more deceptive. This was the first show these were among the works of my first show as Robert Buck. This was a installation I did at Sorry We're Closed, a secondary space in Brussels at the Rudolf Jensen Gallery in 2008. Kind of speaks for itself. So I don't know if you pick up on the subtlety, but there's something happening here that maybe even the artist isn't aware of. But this is the beautiful thing about art. You keep at it. And I tell young artists now, don't throw anything away. Don't throw anything away. I don't care what anyone else says, because it will have meaning for you later. And in, again, preparing for this presentation, I was kind of struck, well, not kind of, I was struck by the uncanny arc of the work from the beginning to the end as an artist who's concerned with subjectivity, identity, and selfhood. That through art, one can make legible an odyssey that we all go through, each individual. But it has this kind of materiality. And other people can share in that odyssey. This was two of a series of paintings I did in 2009 called eye painting with alert paint, which is paint that is used on caution pylons and emergency jackets. So when light hits it, like the flash of your camera, it fluoresces. So this is at the gallery taken with a flash. I chose this image because it's a very sexual image for me. That's just my reading. These are all smoke that I got off the internet. And what I like is that they kind of travel this course. They're taken off the internet. We put them through all sorts of files. They're printed out on canvas. The canvas is primed. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. They're back in the gallery, and lo and behold, boom, someone takes a selfie, and it goes back online. And it travels in a different manifestation or a different life form than it did in the gallery. And this was just when iPhone was introducing the rear-facing or front-facing camera. This, to me, when we were working on it, was the de Kooning, late de Kooning, and the woman. This was a show in 2012 titled Kapanaku, which is Comanche for West. This was not long after I bought a small little piece of paradise on the border in far west Texas, and it was my homage to that space. I'm only showing you a fraction of the show. This is called Fatherland. It's both an homage to Carl Andre, and those red shells were the shells that I collected after my dad and I would shoot these gun pads. So it's kind of like a video game for me, in a way. And then Fatherland because, well, you see the Indian and nickel. And this is so perverse of the US government, to memorialize the American Indian, on the verso of the coin they put the buffalo. But of course it's the slaughter of the buffalo, in many ways how that Holocaust was carried out. I was one day in the desert and I had this thing. It can be playful sometimes, but I like for you to see it abstractly. It's a slab of plastic. It's a computer. It's a parasite. I had it one day in the desert, and it was like man-made time, prehistoric time. What's happening? So I thought I would use black plexi to analogous to that moment where your phone is just about to shut off and it leaves you with a dim image of what was there. And if you look closely, you can see an image at the top, which is this. Again, this kind of image in abeyance. This image that maybe... tugs at you. What is it? If it's something conscious, Is it something unconscious? Is it something the other put there? Maybe you go by it, you don't even see it. But I believe you perceive that something is there. This is razor wire, stalks from a yucca plant, and fabric I found at Mood Fabric in the Garment District in New York City. It's just called Sun, with endless number of ends at the end. This is House of Asterion. I think it speaks for itself. What can I say? Sex and sexuality. That's a piece of driftwood that I found on my property. In around 2014, I started a series of paintings called The Letter, the Litter, in which I would memorialize bits of litter that I found on the street that spoke to me. I often use Roland Barthes' term for that moment in a photograph that smotes you, called the punctum. You have no idea why, but it hits you in a way that is unsettling and inexplicable. So these notes meant something to me, and I had to work with them. So this is, I want the to. So this bling kind of fabric, but this is desire. I want the game to. In other words, I have water and I have coffee, but I want the game too. Or Terry and Takako have a game, but I want that game too. So it can be read in two different ways, as like acquisitive, but also desirous, both being the same thing, really. That's the note. And of course, with my work with diagnostic drawings, anything that a child does in some way or another speaks to me. This is another note. I handled it quite differently because in some way these are about the body. So these things had to fall. Notes, I couldn't see them. I wouldn't get something that was pinned. They had to be on the ground. That I would retrieve from the ground and pick up. Because that gesture of something falling from the body, it's just a scrap of life. It's just a moment of someone's life, lost. But I regain it. And there's a whole narrative that can be built around it. And it's not an easy concept, but I think it's a true concept. That artworks are not unlike something that falls from the body of the artist, like feathers from a bird. And you go to the next. It's up to the museum, the institution, the collector, to do the same thing, to pick it up. I said this during, I gave a lecture or a talk about there's a beautiful, you probably all know it, George O'Keeffe, Summer Days, with the elevated skull of a steer. There's a storm in the background, there's a bouquet, and that to me exemplifies that scavenging. She found it, it smote her, something spoke to her, she couldn't deny it, and she raised the thing up. She elevated it, we could say, to the dignity of a thing. So it's ritualistic, it's fetishistic, it's artistic, the lines, it's just a beautiful memorialization of this encounter with someone, and I've done it myself, who hasn't? You're looking for that thing that's going to speak to you. Marcel Duchamp called this, when speaking about the ready-made, you have an appointment with the ready-made. You're not prepared for it. That's the beauty of it. Again, these are kind of largish. I think this is 48 by 3.5. This was a very disturbing note that I found in a thrift store in New Mexico, the parking lot. But it was also very disturbing fabric that I found at Mood Fabrics. I still can't make out torn denim against a birch tree, torn denim against a Bob Gober Black's leg. Then the pearls. I mean, it's just bizarre to me. I can't imagine what this fabric is meant to do. But it spoke to the body, and it spoke to the really haunting nature of this note. This is a series I began also in 2000, and this was 2014. At the end of the day, I am a sensitive artist. We live in a time increasingly of less and less control. Hopefully that will all change somewhat in November. I'm not a political artist. I'm not a capital P artist, but I am political. This is a series called, at the end of the day, I'm repeating myself, in which I took images off of the internet, which is the biggest dumpster we have, speaking of litter, of a recent United States trauma, an act of violence or malfeasance. And this is the Oklahoma City bombing in Oklahoma City. I coupled that with something taken from nature that had a subliminal relationship to the thing itself. Because the driving text for me was Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. Like, why do we repeat? Death drive. We won't talk about that tonight. But that's what he found, that there is something beyond pleasure that persists. And as a civilization, and as subjects, this is why, just one more line of Coke, and then suddenly you choose the rest of that scenario. But you know when you go too far, right? So that's the drive. And we do it as a civilization. So this is a bee's nest, a hornet's nest. So the net, like cells, terrorist cells. But also, for me, to my eye, it looks like a hole in the side of the building. So it's a kind of bombing itself. And to be clear, that black and white is silkscreen, and the color is digital, and I felt like we are, at least at this point in time, the interface between the digital and silkscreen as an art historic. I mean, the silkscreen is as old now as oils, pigments. But it's still about the body. If you know Wade Guyton's work, even Wade's work, when he pulls something from the printer, that's the body. I don't know that we'll ever get to a moment, even with robots, will it be art to our eyes if it's not about the human body? So this is also why I'm interested in the body and the speaking body. And this beautiful relay that I just now see between the three of us. Something I say is transmitted to Shelley, is transmitted to Bob, is transmitted to you. I get chills. It's a beautiful distillation of the way that language works from one to the other. And how language, really one by one, is spoken differently. You can see I'm gesturing, I mean, my goodness, I'm gesturing more than they are. So something in me dramatizes the body in its relationship to language. And again, I think they're a poetic, not only do they do a service to us all by widening the audience, but there's something about their relationship to language as well, which says things about it that I couldn't say. It's not in my experience. It's not in my past. That's the initial image. This is really one of my favorites from the series. This is the Aurora Cinema in Colorado, 2012, I think. Batman. So, I always get them confused. You have a stalactite and a stalagmite, where you would find bats in a cave. I showed this to a French psychoanalyst, and she just loved it, because she goes like this, it goes up, and it comes down. So, I'm laughing, but this is a kind of a memorial, the phallus, to those people, citizens among us, who can't stand that the status of the father in the 20th century waned. It got weak, it crumbled. When you think of the church, what do you think of? Pedophilia. When you think of the government, what do you think of? Don't think about that too much right now. So these institutions, family is as wide a spectrum as identity is now. It's not that. That's a beautiful thing. The scary thing are those folks that cannot abide not having that traditional father figure in place. The phallus is a minus because of detumescence. It's only an imaginary thing, or it's a symbolic thing, but it's not a real thing. But there are those among us who believe in that status. We can talk more about this maybe in the Q&A, but this is why the future is feminine, because that logic has changed. Also in the series, yes, the monarch butterfly, I was very happy to learn. The migratory path, this is the pleasure of research. The migratory path of the monarch is through Columbine, Colorado. I also felt that the psychology of these two young men was to mirror one another. I also like this one a lot because it's like a feeding frenzy. More. Give us more of whatever this death and disaster stuff is, because we consume it every night. That's ideology at work. So this, it turns out, was a breakthrough piece for me. This is part of the Letter, the Litter series. Anything that I found on the street had to have writing on it. So you have it here. The letter, the litter, is from Finnegan's Wake, and the full quote is, the letter, the litter, the soother, the bither. Of course, the letter became very important to me, and a letter that falls, because one fell from my name. And by the way, as an aside, if they didn't get it the first time, I said, it's an exchange of vowels. Okay, chuckle. If I didn't get a laugh, then I would say, it was a vowel movement. And I would usually get a better response. This was part of a portfolio of images that I found in the trash on my block. by Karachi, 17th century. I could be getting this wrong, probably earlier, 16th century. It's basically a Catholic Kama Sutra in which mythological figures are, there are lithographs of all sorts of coitus, intercourse outdoors, coitus a tergo, coitus a plein air, etc. You get the idea. I think this is the lion of Nimeon, if you can see on his head, and then the tail between his legs, and right back here, there's a figure, there's the club he used, and right in the back behind the fox fur is, or the mink fur is who he slayed. I'm not familiar with the mythology, but here's the rub. Again, store-bought fabric in which I did interventions, painterly interventions. You can see some of the blocks. I thought it was going to be one thing, but in the studio, something that once you think is going to go right, fuck, it's going to go left. And you just have to abide that. But this fur belonged to my mother. So once you make this correlation, you got to go there. In other words, it became the eye of a needle for me. So what? What does that mean? My father was very present in my work as Robert Buck. I'm sorry. Freudian slip. Robert Beck. But my mother was not really there. My mother was the artist. Probably each of you have in your parents one that is a more like the force majeure, the one that has to be reckoned with. So I know in a deeper aquifer, there was more to me, for me to do, and more to me. The fur was something that I had in the studio. It was an artifact from my mother after she died. But I have these things in the studio. And they're right there. They're right there. They're just right there. Or they're in a cubby somewhere. So financially, peaks and valleys as an artist. I had an invitation to make new work. And I thought, I'm going to do something I've never done. I'm not going to rely on the other. I'm not going to ask the other for a fabrication. I'm not going to ask the other for a frame. I'm going to just take what's already here. That's why I say don't throw anything away. Because what you'll see in the new work are comprised of found objects, but what I call refound found objects, because I found them once and I re-found them again. What I'm going to show you now is work in the studio. No one's seen it. They're they're formations. I don't call them sculptures. Unless I'm speaking to people where it matters what I call them. I call them formations because they can be reformed at any time. That's the feeling I seem to have with them. Recuperations, because I'm recuperating something. Or, this is my favorite, derangements. And I refer to my work quite seriously as deranged. Because I need a term that's not 21st century or 20th century bound. Because if we can't keep up with the velocity and the madness of the day artistically, I think we're doing something wrong. I also refer to my work as mental, not as conceptual. conceptual is tied to a generation that it should be tied to, but it's also tied to the academic, corporate dimension. Like when dealers say to me, I'm a little preachy at the moment, pardon me, but when dealers say to me, oh, you know, it's conceptual or post-conceptual, to me it's like saying it's beige or it's red or it's black. This is just for me, this is my singularity as an artist. I was recently on a panel for my friend Cheryl at the new museum, and I said these things. I said mental and deranged, and which means to derange, to move through an open field. And velocity. Who has got time to paint, really, anymore? No offense to painters, but if you know the work of Isa Genskin, I mean, that woman is just like, I'm going through TSA and I'm going to show you a plate from a seat from the plane, or there's just no, you get the madness of what she does. And this for me is a way to try and keep up. So that's a bit of a preamble, probably a nervous one because I'm about to show you these works. This is from the studio. And this was probably 2 weeks ago. This work I started August 15th, so it's really only a month old. And if any of you have been to my studio, you know how wildly uncharacteristic of an obsessional artist this is. So this is the first finished work. It's called Fountain, after the Duchamp piece. And each of the pieces are elevated. You can't really see them in the slides, but they float. They float off the ground maybe about an inch, because I wanted to give it this, like it's breathing, like it's not resting, like it could change, it could fly away. And again, I bought nothing. This is an homage, not an homage, this is a portrait of, it's called Corpus Christi, parenthetically, a portrait of my brother Christopher's body. I had an older brother who died because he had spina bifida, and he was hydrocephalic, which meant his head was quite large when he died. As Robert Beck, I would never speak of him. Pushed away. That was because of the parental wish. 1960s, age of the madmen, you didn't talk about these things. But he exerted an unquantifiable influence on my life. So this is a strange image I found of a vision of Christ. That is a cock ring, and that is a cement paver that it's sitting on. He was paralyzed from the waist down as well. This is a small store-bought canvas that I burned, singed over my fire pit in the border. My place is near the border, and I then put this patch of a Levi pant and put a stud in it, and it's simply called Fire Pit Stud. There's a sense of play to my work and immediacy now that I'm very excited about. This piece is called As Above, So Not Below. That's a dog muzzle. It has something to do with the masculine side and the feminine side. The masculine side is limited by the phallus. The feminine side is not. Something escapes. This is a logical correlation I'm making. This is not why I made the piece. As I may have said earlier, psychoanalysis is simply a more effective way for me to frame my work over, say, the academic discourse or the discourse of the marketplace. This is a found, again, all these things were in the studio. It's a store-bought frame and a found drawing. The piece is called Ready Frame. Ready Frame and Artificial Existence. This is one of my favorite pieces. Why? Because of that girl. That girl, in contrast with that almost suffragette image behind her, and who would package a frame like that against this? How does this young woman negotiate these two representations of woman? This piece you can't really see so well because there's so much stuff behind it, but it's this wood plinth, the screen, cock ring, and orange ribbon. And it's called Buck Naked or Napoleon in the Wilderness. Napoleon in the Wilderness is a 1941 painting by Max Ernst. I'll show you a slide later. It's beautiful. But I don't know why, when I did that, I was like, where have I seen this before? And that's where, I don't know if you'll see the correlation, but of course the screen is a body. This is called No Longer a Pipe Dream. Molt, as in molting. That's an old laptop of mine. This piece is I don't know, you guys got to decide for me. This is the wild one. It's called 101, and then parenthetically 101, 01, 01, 01, 01, 01, 01. Another piece. This piece is called Language Speaks a Love All Its Own. That's a thermometer from a thermostat, from a water heater at my cabin. This piece goes on a wall, but it's not there yet. This is Susan Smith, who drowned her two boys, I think in the late 1990s. This is the Kleenex box turned splayed and turned inside out. I'm just going to run through to the last one here. This is one of the most recent ones I did, maybe last week. It's called, I love an anagram, so it's called Spine, Penis, Horse, Shore, Open, Poem. And that's it. Thank you very much. Let me quickly show you. Yeah, this is Napoleon lost in the wilderness. And Duchamp was my touchstone for this work. He seems to be the only artist explicitly who dealt with female sexuality, sexuation, and desire. And lo and behold, he's one of the most, probably the most important conceptual artists of the 20th century.
So do you think that Duchamp was pointing us in the direction we found ourselves?
Yes.
The place?
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you think about étant donné, where am I going? Sorry, I'm lost on this. Doesn't really want to go. Anyway, you know, I think we all know what étant donné looks like. Yeah, I did. I got it. That's pretty much what Freud asked at the beginning of the last century. What does a woman want? And for a man or a woman, what is your response when confronted to this scene? And Duchamp, in his kind of mad way, had a whole system for what these images and these icons meant. But the interesting thing about étant donné, if any of you have not seen it, is that before you confront this hole in the wall, there are two doors, two big wooden doors, and two peepholes. So the gaze is very much activated, and you're looking through these peepholes at this very provocative, to say the least, diorama. But what I didn't understand is that there's a guard in that room, or there's someone behind you. So while you look, you are being looked at. And for me, therein lies the rub of this piece. So I'm here for questions or just conversation. Yes?
How did you get into silkscreen when you first started that?
I was introduced, I forget which piece I did that utilized silkscreen for the first time, but I was introduced by a friend to a master printer. And we got on like gangsters, and it was just like, okay, I'm going to move in this direction to have him make something for me. But silkscreen is, it's a bit antiquated at this point. I mean, it still can be utilized like paint can, but it's one of those things that's moving with us, I think, in other words. Do you work in silkscreen?
It's just always fascinated me, and I've never really done it. So do you prefer like digital now, or?
I prefer digital, but I prefer fucking with digital now. And that's where I would go next. To take something and weaken the colors or change the colors. Yeah.
I was curious too. Do you have, like some of these works, I always get curious, you know, like how did you do that, or how did you go about it? And I feel like you ask some artists and they'll say like, oh, well, a magician doesn't reveal their secrets. Like, do you have a response when people ask those kind of questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Spread the love.
Yeah. I mean, I like that, but
Yeah.
I guess, because the one that kind of drew my curiosity was like when you were explaining the shotgun into the spiral.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, was that just, kind of how that worked? Or how did the process?
That was, it started very small, as I was saying with most of my work. It's just like, oh, let's try this. So we had a rifle and a sketch pad, and I had grown up shooting beer cans and light bulbs and egg cartons, and I thought, as I said, why not a sketch pad? It's loaded, no pun, for an artist. So we would prop the pads up against a tree, and we were maybe 12 inches away, and we'd shoot into them. But that left it's a beautiful kind of hole, but with just the star shape of gunpowder. So then a hunting friend of my dad said, well, why don't you use a 12-gauge pumpkin ball slug? And if you know firearms or shotguns, the pumpkin ball is a ball of gunpowder that sits at the end of the slug. So it's not shot. Shot just blew the pad away. But a pumpkin ball is a concentrated, it made that hole that you saw. And then what it does is in the animal or the prey, it opens up. So it goes in as a single circle, or produces that circle, and makes that bigger bloom of gunpowder. And then it was like, all right, well, what would this be like with wax? Because the heat in the wax must have some, some chemistry. I don't know what the word I'm looking for. There must be some reaction.
And did you realize the relationship of the wax conceptually after the fact? I mean, when you decided to use that particular wax, or did you think wax and then go and look for the mortician wax? Did I understand that correctly?
No, it was the other way around. I was watching a crime show and someone used the word mortician's wax. That's what I did, and I'm like, oh my goodness, wax has a long history. So I was interested in entering that history, but at an angle. This, one of the pieces I didn't show, this piece, this totem, that mass of black, that's a custom made. Dodge custom made a black wound filler for me because I really wanted to be in the hole. I really wanted to feel the weight of the loss. So I don't know that I would shoot these, but they're coming up in other ways in the studio.
What is it about that wax that makes it a particularly good wound filler?
Are you a mortician? Good, because you would know better. But I think because it's pliable, it's wax, and there's another additive. I'm forgetting at the moment what it is. But they also, it's perfumed, if you will, with lemongrass. So it's a pungent, pungent smell, which is, what calla lilies used to be used for when covering the corpse. What might interest you is that the waxes come in a spectrum of color. Not a lot, maybe like 7 or 8. But the red is used mostly for the face, the lips. There's pink, there's straw, depending on the complexion of the corpse. And they're used, it's morbid, but it's used as to beautify, you could say. To make a hole in the cadaver full again, to give it consistency again, to give the whole consistency.
How did Freud and psychoanalysis get its claws and its wings into your work?
That's a beautiful way to put it. I was a young person in high school and was interested in dreams, and I came across the interpretation of dreams by Freud, and I kind of stayed with it. And my childhood was not a great one, so we all have ways of amending or rectifying that, and art is high among those means. And I stayed with the psychoanalysis, and then when I was in the Whitney program, Mary Kelly, who is a conceptual artist, was teaching the writings of Jacques Lacan, and he develops from Freud. He re-radicalized Freud in a very powerful way, and I then just continued. And I can't, it's very difficult for me to use an academic discourse to frame my work. It's not as effective as psychoanalysis, given loss and trauma and the object and this idea of formation. And all of us in life, whether you're an artist or not, look for experiences or things or people that are commensurate with your experiences in life. So we're also looking for ways to talk about those experiences that are commensurate to or equivalent to the experiences. Okay, cool.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.